Brian, I want to start with you. You know, there's been a lot of talk about iOS and how different it is going to be. What sort of changes are you expecting?
I think it's going to be much more stripped down than the previous versions of the operating system. I think they're going to use a much thinner font. They're going to move to what's called a flat design, which means that a lot of the icons and things won't look like real-life objects. Like a notepad won't actually look like a notepad. It might just be a gray square. I think they're going to make it a lot more flat like that, but I think they're also going to infuse a lot of new color, a lot of bright color, and they're really going to update it a bit. You know, they need to show leadership here. They need to show that they can get out ahead of what's happening on Android and on other operating systems, and I think that we're going to see, a lot of meaningful changes. It's still going to be familiar, but it's going to be, very new at the same time.
So potentially no more yellow notepad, no more wooden bookshelves, some of the things that have been the landmarks of iOS since the very beginning. I want to get to Paul Kedrosky now. Paul, a lot of people have said iOS is starting to look dated, and I should mention that Tim Cook is on stage right now presenting at WWDC. How important is this iOS update for Apple?
Oh, it's hugely important on a whole bunch of different dimensions. I mean, yeah, it is looking extremely dated. I mean, it started, these sort of vestiges of our old physical world, you just kind of felt strange, It's this reminder of how things used to be, as opposed to remembering that most of the people using these products increasingly are of a generation where most of these metaphors have, very, very little meaning, which makes it somewhat bizarre that they kind of hang on as long as they have. So that's at one level. But at a deeper level, it's more that just the Apple interface had begun to feel very rigid. You look at Android and your ability to have widgets and other things installed that provide you this kind of continuous flow of information and access to services in other ways than just scrolling through all the icon screens. Apple started to seem like it wasn't just leading, but it was feeling, very, very dated. So it's easy to dismiss all of this and say, really, we're talking about new icons, changed colors and fonts. Is this what Apple has come to? But it's more a reflection of the way the market's changed. That, you've tried a bunch of things, and this is the way the market's going, and Apple needs to be there.
That's right.
And there's been a lot of talk about, these design changes and Apple becoming a design leader once again. Jonathan Ive, Apple's lead designer, we know had dominion over not just the hardware this time, but also the software. I want to bring John back into this conversation. John, Johnny Ive doesn't typically take the stage at WWDC, but any chance we could see an appearance from him today?
I think there is. There were some photos of him yesterday making his way in as they did all the preparation for this. Apple has a star in Johnny Ive, a guy that has a lot of mystery around him, a guy who is admired by a lot of people in the tech community for the designs that made Apple, what it is today with the iPod and the iPhone and the iPad. And I think that on the software side, here is a company, as you guys were saying earlier, that hasn't made a lot of design changes since the iPhone was first introduced. And he's got a lot of explaining to do, at least communicating, Apple does, in terms of what the new software experience is going to be. Earlier we were talking with the CEO of Evernote, a very popular app. Phil Libin is his name, and he said after each of these events, they have to go back to their headquarters, they sit around as a company, and they say, all right, what did Apple change, and how is that going to change how we do business? This really matters to all those companies that are making all their money tied to that little app that appears on your iPhone or your iPad. So if there are sweeping changes, and if they're, even if they're just design and it doesn't really change where you find things, I think there's going to be a need for Apple to communicate that well because of all these people who come to these events to find out those very things.
Right. And Tim Cook continuing his remarks right now in San Francisco. He's talking about Apple's global presence, mentioning that Apple now has 407 Apple stores now worldwide. Brian Blair, I was talking with Brian Marshall of ISI Group last week. He said that his expectations for this particular WWDC are low. Would you characterize your expectations that way, low expectations?
I think they are low, and part of that's reflected in the stock, I think, but I think it's also because there are going to be no new iPads or new iPhones announced today. The hardware focus, I believe, is going to be on the MacBook side. That's a relatively low volume product every quarter, about 4 or 5 million units a quarter, versus 47 or 30 million of the other products, or 20 million iPads, I guess. And so I think that given that, and given that this is largely going to be software focused, I do think the expectations are relatively low. Now we'll see what they do with iRadio, but I do agree with that.